For all you professional brewers out there, I'm here to tell you that planning brew schedules is easier than ever with Imperial Yeast, who guarantee that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 4 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. A killer deal from an incredible company. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it is time to up your game. Check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. IPA has held the craft beer popularity crown for a long time, and while certain preferred characteristics have morphed over the years, the style was typically defined by its moderately assertive bitterness, noticeable citrus and pine hop aroma, clean fermentation, and of course clear appearance. Even earlier regional variants from areas like the Pacific Northwest and Midwest of the United States were generally a play on that same theme. That is until relatively recently, of course, when haze became all the craze. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about all things New England IPA is contributor Malcolm Frazer.
New England IPA, it's kind of funny. We keep talking about it as a newer style, but at some point we have to stop.
Yeah, it's true.
I guess when you compare it to, porter or even, traditional English IPA, from late 1800s, whatever, it's new in that regard. But really, people have been brewing those styles since easily 2015 or 16.
Right.
But the harbinger of the style, Heady Topper, which is debatable anyways, because John Kimmich himself will say they're not the same. But I think it's like an iteration.
Yeah.
It's a progression. As soon as people started making IPAs that were hazy and quote juicier, it was almost like, oh, we have permission to do this, Let's get crazy,
yeah.
So, I mean, really, people have been brewing these for, I don't know, what's the math on that? 6 years at least.
Yeah. Well, I qualified it with using the term relatively. And like you said, I think the newness of it, the novelty of it is starting to wear off, but it's still relative to a bunch of other styles, particularly when you look at typical or like normal American IPA. The hazy, juicy version is relatively new, and now it has taken the world by storm, so I guess we can stop qualifying it as that. But in general, I'm not really a mega fan of IPA. There are those that I really enjoy, but it's just not my favorite style by any means. That said, the ones that I do like have tended to be clear. In terms of IPA, it's clear, crisp with that piney, citrusy hop character. Something like Union Jack from Firestone Walker, I love that beer, and I actually think Russian River and Pliny the Elder, absolutely delicious. I still really enjoy that style of IPA. So when these hazy versions started to gain popularity 5-6 years ago, I was kind of confused because it seemed a little off to me. But today, you can't go to a brewery tap room without seeing multiple hazy IPA options, which I think speaks volumes for the style. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the arguably limited history of New England IPA, as well as standard approaches to making them, and my own attempt at brewing one short and shoddy style. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy by committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. You'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Earlier this month, Anderson Valley Brewing Company's Val Allen spent an hour with patrons. It was incredible. And coming up in July is Dan Pixley of Milk the Funk fame. Dan is one of the most intelligent brewers I know, especially when it comes to sour and funky styles. So I've no doubt this is going to be an excellent session. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about becoming a patron at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Our feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system. It comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brewing process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Daniel Lott reached out and wanted to share his experience with electric brewing in Germany. This was in response to the electric brewing episode that we did a couple of weeks ago. I wanted to share my experience with electric brewing in Germany, he says. I did not drink much beer before I moved for my job to Bamberg, Germany. I didn't know that I was moving to the city with the largest brewery density in the world. Very jealous I am of you, Daniel. A famous German alcoholic beverage is, I'm going to butcher this, Glühwein, something like that, which is a heated type of wine that's typically made during the Christmas season at the many Christmas markets in Germany. It's prepared in and served from large 20 to 30 liter electric cookpots called Glühwein kettles. Germans are typically very environmentally conscious, so it makes perfect sense that the homebrewers would elect to use these electric kettles to make their beer. I bought one of these for about 120 euros and brewed 2 batches with it before I moved back to the U.S. The portability aspect of electric kettles was fantastic, allowing me to easily transport all of my brewing gear to my German friends' courtyards or garages to brew together. My kettle is 2200 watts and takes the typical German outlet voltage of 240 volts. Before I moved back to the U.S., I purchased a few German-style wall outlets so that I could wire up a 240-volt circuit at home. I think that's rad. I finally got around to doing this in February and brewed my first U.S. batch of Franconian-style beer in my electric Glühwein kettle. It went just as smoothly as it did in Germany. I can control my Hockert step mash temps with ease, and a very vigorous boil for 60 minutes is absolutely no problem at all. I am very happy to see electric brewing taking off in the United States because I often had fears I'd struggle to find a replacement kettle if my German kettle ever malfunctions. I agree with you, Daniel, that electric brewing is incredible. I think I've shared that more than enough at this point.
I wish I had an electric setup. That's something I really want to do, actually. My house is perfect for it. I have a basement. It's sub-level.
Oh, man.
And I have a little section with a bar that I would never use except for to hold all my ridiculous glassware. So I'd rather just convert that to a indoor brewing. And it's right against the wall, so I could have a ventilation.
Yeah.
It's near a drain. It's near the main house drain, which I could tap into.
Oh.
I want to do it so bad.
Yeah.
You know, I really, that's the way I want to go, especially, you know, in Ohio where we have some more severe winters.
Right.
That extend my brewing season. I really want to do it. It's just the financial leap at this point is a bit onerous. So
yeah, it is amazing. What's really interesting to me is that it seems like here in America that we are way behind the curve when it comes to brewing. The energy source, for our brewing is, here it's so common to see people on using propane to power.
Yeah.
And everywhere else you go, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, everybody is using electric. And I think in part because the 240 volt thing, we're like one of the only places where 120 is normal. But man, there are some killer options out there for 120 volt. We just, Andy Carter just wrote up his review on the very inexpensive Brewzilla from More Beer. And that thing, he loves it and thing works great. So it's getting easier to get into electric brewing. And Daniel, I think it's awesome that you wired your house with a German plug. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. I may not brew or even drink much barley wine, but it's certainly a style that I admire quite a bit, especially when it's done right. Well, listener James Bywater sent me a barley wine made by Ketos Brewing out of Salt Lake City, Utah, that he thought my buddies and I might like.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
We're live with old Jersey and old Tim.
This looks nice.
It does. It's got a very amber color to it. What do you want to do with this? Do you want to put it in your mouth or your eyeballs?
That's good.
What is it?
I don't know. That's got a little aftertaste going on.
You're the guy that goes in the breach. I always follow it. I'm like, what do you think?
I have no idea what it is.
What should I expect?
It's kind of soapy at the end.
Soapy.
It's different.
Soapy. That's what. Yeah. Sometimes you're dirty. You need to be cleaned.
Yeah.
My first impression is bitter.
Oh, very. It's like an IPA. It's bitter.
Dude, you gotta. We have an agreement. We don't say IPA until the third sip, just in case.
Okay.
We don't want to be made to look like fools.
It's soapy tasting.
I don't think it's an IPA, brother.
I do not care for it.
You sound like Tim Timberg, the newest entry to the presidential campaign.
It's still lingering around. I don't like it.
It's not bad.
It's not horrible, but I'm not going to drink another sip.
I think it's not that bad.
You want the rest of mine? This whole time I have not taken another sip and it's still hanging around.
Pay this man his money. He beat me fair and square.
What do you think it is?
I think it's a beer. It's a barley wine. You agree or not? Let's rate it as a barley wine. As a barley wine, how would you rate it? 0 to Devil.
Devil was good.
You remember that Devil's barley wine? Oh my God, it was so good.
I'm going to rate it 11.2%.
I'll give it 3 for a total of not devils.
Well, Jersey nailed it. I actually quite enjoyed this barley wine and noted it as having a very nice toasty malt profile with a hint of cherry in the finish, something I typically associate with the use of a decent amount of Munich malt. I've heard other people describe it that way as well. I'm not certain if that's where it came from. I also perceived a rather sharp bitterness, and I think that's what it was. Timmy pointed it out as well. And I just wonder if perhaps the beer was maybe a tad young when we were drinking it. But either way, it was a really tasty beer. Keto seems to be doing good things there in Salt Lake City.
I like barley wines. I don't drink a lot of them because it's more of a toilsome drink. To me, it's more like at the end of the night, if you're on the fire with your friends,
right?
You crack one and you all have 4 ounces and enjoy it. It's almost like drinking port,
Yeah, I agree.
Who really drinks port? Anyone who drinks port. But anyways, the analogy stands. It's more like a savoring discussion, enjoy beer. That's for me personally. But I really do agree with the youngness on barley wine. Sometimes if you load them up with hops, they become harsh.
Yeah.
But I love that aging character, and I agree with the Munich malt thing. It does kind of give me like a cherry wood.
Yeah.
And sometimes orange character, like a aged orange marmalade like character.
Sure, yeah.
I love that. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, whatever it was, it worked really well in this. And that wasn't the only beer we've had from Ketos so far. And again, they really seem to be doing good things in a state that limits. You can't. I guess in Salt Lake City, you can't sell kegs or serve beer on draft outside of a brewery that's over 5% ABV or something. So the fact they're producing barley wines that are pushing 12% ABV, pretty cool to me. And I appreciate James sending it into us. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, when we return from this break, the focus will be on New England IPA. We'll be right back. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Juicy, cloudy, creamy, hazy. These are just a few of the adjectives associated with one of the newest beer styles to hit the scene in the last decade. And while many initially felt New England IPA was just another in a long line of passing beer fads, a temporary haze craze, if you will, this doesn't seem to be the case. Everywhere you turn, there's a hazy New England IPA, and the people are drinking it up. Suffice to say, any IPA is here to stay.
Yeah, I think I remember reading an article in 2015 or 16 from the Brewers Association saying like the haze craze, is it here to stay? So it had obviously been around for a long enough to warrant an article being written.
Sure.
So if you think of Heady Topper getting popular around 2011 or so, and yes, we touched on in the beginning, the opening segment, that even John Kimmich says not the same.
Right.
But, it is like the precursor. It's the initial push towards this look that became accepted. Well, here it is, 2000, was it 20? Yeah, 2020. And, we've been talking about, is this a fad? Is it going to go away for at least 6 years? Right. In my book. So, I like them when they're done well, and I jokingly talked about it in an article about how the 98% of the bad ones give the good 2% a bad name.
It's true.
What happened is it became very popular, and then everyone says, "Oh, that sells. Let's brew one."
Right.
And they make a bad one, and that's a shame, because when it's done well, it can be very, very enjoyable drink. But the thing is, there's also many interpretations of it. So the number one thing I would stress is, if you're brewing a New England style IPA or a hazy pale ale, whatever you want to call it, is try not to be too narrowly defined. So there is a style guideline, right? And that's just because people like to enter beers and compete. But they run the gamut. I've seen them dry. I've seen them have some bitterness. I've seen them not have bitterness. I've seen them dank. I've seen them all juicy.
Yeah.
And then you add whatever additives. You've seen the milkshake ones with lactose. You've seen fruited one. I mean, come on. Yeah. It's so fall all over the place that, to say it must be this, to me, is silly.
Well, and I'll be honest, if people enjoy something, I've said this a million times, but I don't know why anybody would care what somebody else enjoys drinking. I mean, for you to judge them says more about you than it does the person who's enjoying the damn beer,
Well, it's fun. First of all,
I guess so. People. For some people, it is.
It is, but it's also like when they're bad. And to me, because I love beer so much, I'm an evangelical, whatever.
Proselytizing beer drinker.
Proselytizing beer.
There you
Jesus.
go. Yeah.
So when I drink a bad one and someone enjoys it, I mean, bad is obviously subjective, so it's a silly argument to begin with. But I'm sitting here thinking, like, this one's harsh. This one's plasticky. Why are you considering this good? And what I'm concerned about is that people start becoming accepting of things that are truly faulted. So, to sit there and say blueberries are better than strawberries, obviously opinion, right?
Yeah, right.
They're both fruits. But when you give someone a beer that has, it's loaded with acetaldehyde and is plasticky, and then someone likes that, I guess in the end, it's silly, because if you like it, you like it.
Exactly.
But what I'm worried about is that now brewer number 2 goes, well, screw it. I can make a very bad version of a beer and people will drink it. So let's do that.
Yeah, I get that on a principle level. As somebody who's so invested in the beer and brewing scene, we've done an entire episode where we really dug into kind of the controversial perspectives on New England IPA. So we'll kind of save that for that. You can go back and listen to that. What I'm interested in terms of the history of this, again, relatively new style. When it first started out, there was a group of homebrewers after, of course, The Alchemist did their thing and were releasing Heady Topper. And if people recall, on the can, it even said, drink from the can. And I think a part of that is that John didn't want to have to deal with people saying this doesn't look clear like the typical IPAs that are out there, but just drink it and you'll enjoy it. And that's what really matters. It's not about looks. Nowadays, people have embraced, not necessarily to speak to the folks who are doing everything they can to make a murky beer, but people have embraced this idea that you can make a very, very hop forward IPA that may not be as clear, as Union Jack or something, and it's still good.
And I love that color though. So some of the ones that are like the light orange and even like the high glowing yellow. Yeah, I think it's pleasing. I mean, to me, a wit beer and a Hefeweizen are just gorgeous, and especially when they're backlit, for photography or drinking on the patio purposes. It almost looks like it should have a noise coming from it, like, oh, they're so beautiful.
It looks like a glass of juice, is what it looks like to me, and which is fine.
Not always, but yeah, it has I get what you're saying, the juicy thing, the juicy look.
Right.
But it's different than that, because it has this like subtle turbidity, and of course, what causes that glow is light refracting off of the little piece. It's called the Tyndall effect, right? So I mean, you can look that up, but it's light scatter, and it does literally amplify the colors. It is a glow, and when that's achieved by a well brewed New England IPA, our Hefeweizen, yada yada yada. To me, it's so beautiful. And when someone gives me one that's like this murky color, I just want to throw it against the wall. It's so ugly.
Dude, I couldn't agree more with you. You know that. My point being, though, is there was a group of homebrewers, and I consider you a part of that, Malcolm. Brian Hall, Brewlosophy's Brian Hall was also a part of it. Scott Janisch, Michael Tonsmeyer, and Ed Coffey are kind of the group that I saw as really trying to advance this new, interesting, particularly in the way it looks, style. And there was a lot that came from that. One of the interesting things, before we get into the actual beer itself, that was confusing for me at first, and in fact, I called New England IPA a Northeastern or a Northeast IPA, I think in the first article we ever wrote about it on the website, but that didn't stick. What ended up sticking was New England. And I'm curious if you have any idea. I asked Ed about it a while ago, and he was kind of confused. I think he was kind of doing the Northeast thing, and then everyone else started doing the New England, and it just ultimately got, turned into NEIPA.
Yeah, I don't know, because there were some people calling it Vermont IPA, and then in typical fashion, Mr. Kimmich said, like, well, that seems a bit arrogant to me, because that's the way he is. He's deferential,
Yeah.
So, and I'm talking like I know him. I don't know the guy, but he basically said, "Oh, Vermont IPA that's a bit arrogant. If people want to call it that, fine." And I'm just quoting him from an article. So I think it became more embraced in this area. So you have Tired Hands. Which is actually more, but it's more Pennsylvania, right? You have Hill Farmstead, definitely Treehouse, which is right by where I grew up. So that's all New England. So I think it became more regional than it did a specific state.
Right.
And now why calling it Northeast versus New England, I don't know. Maybe it just sounds better. I don't know that.
It seems to me that it literally was just what stuck, and somehow that became the meme. That you call it New England, and it was still NEIPA. I was thinking about when I first started brewing, IPA was just IPA, which meant it was really, really bitter and hurt your teeth basically, and then over the years it evolved into this being more hop forward with that citrusy, piney flavors and aromas without being necessarily, tooth enamel damaging bitter. And then I started to hear about things like Midwest IPA, and then there was East Coast IPA, and all of those again were kind of modeled after popular breweries at the time in those areas. But the interesting thing about them all was the focus to me was on malt level. It was never on on the hoppiness or the bitterness necessarily. If you go to the Midwest or the East Coast compared to a West Coast IPA, which isn't even really a style, I kind of think of these regional versions of IPA as just being slight, plays on a theme. East Coast and Midwest ones tended to amplify that malt character more, which did blend well, with the hops that they were playing with, and they were different than the just hyper hop water West Coast IPAs that we all fell in love with.
It's neat because I think the regional names, additives, the modifiers came in as they started separating. So East Coast was probably closer to what the IPA was, Old World IPA,
right?
Which is my new theory, by the way. Why it became New England IPA, just created now when you were talking, is because the other one was the Old England IPA.
There we go.
and now that is now the official answer.
Yeah, there we go. Take it and run with it.
Yeah, it's New England IPA because this is the New World, the New England IPA.
Yeah.
So, anyways, after that, so East Coast, they tended, a lot of these breweries out here are. I'm speaking like I'm in Massachusetts, but. A lot of those breweries were using English yeast that they had brought over. John Kimmich says he uses a yeast he got from, I think, Vermont Brewing, from...
Greg Noonan, right, yeah.
Yeah, Greg Noonan. So a lot of the ones out here were like an English variant, and it may have modified over time, whatever. And I believe Bell's, Two Hearted is an English variant, and it modified over time, and it got a flavor they liked and locked it in. So the Midwest Bell's IPA and the East IPA were kind of maltier, which English yeast will do for you.
Right.
Had more ester profile. And then, meanwhile, you crazy cats over in California were making the beer lighter in color, lighter in malt, and just super hoppy and bitter.
Right. What's crystal malt? I mean, I think we dropped it. West Coast dropped crystal malt a long time ago.
Yeah. So that became that thing. And meanwhile, the East Coast New England IPA was a riff off of East Coast IPA, but using the English yeast and increasing the hell out of the hops in late hopping. So it's kind of like almost a meld between West Coast hopping rates and the maltiness, the creaminess of England. Meanwhile, completely trashing and getting away from the subtlety of English balance.
Exactly.
It's like balance, restraint. No, let's have none of that.
Yeah. Hops.
Hop was put hops up until the point when you drink it. We'll continuously add hops until someone is actually putting it in their mouth.
Exactly. Well, let's do this. Let's dig into the style a bit and talk about what you should expect just in terms of the various different descriptors. Appearance, obviously. You expect it to be hazy. I like the way that you described it as almost like a yellow glow or an orange glow. To me, if I'm going to drink one of these beers, and I'm totally open to doing that, I want it to look like that. What I absolutely won't drink is if you serve me one and it looks brown or purple, or it just looks like mud. And people use like gravy and mud as a joke to make fun of the style. I'm not saying, I will say this though, if you serve me one that looks like that, don't expect me to drink it, because anytime I've had it, it's disgusting. So
I appearance doesn't always predict flavor,
right?
But it tends to, and usually the ones like look like that are yeasty. They have yeasty bite to them, or they're overloaded in hops. They probably needed a few more days in the tank. If you enjoy them, good for you, and good for the breweries being able to sell them. Other than my opening rant about how you're ruining beer, that is partially tongue in cheek, but there's an element of truth and opinion there. I think it's disgusting, and I think it's bad. They oxidize quickly. There's more stuff for oxygen to react to and temperature to increase the rate of oxidation and react to it. So they're not very shelf stable. They usually have craptastic foam, which is why people always serve them with the infinity pour and everything. To each their own. If you like that, cool for you, I guess.
Well, yeah. Well, and the other thing when it comes to the way these things look that I'm really turned off by is when you get a pint of it and within a minute and a half you've got something settling at the bottom of the glass. That I don't want that in my body. Whatever's falling out of that beer should stay out of it. And I've heard of breweries who, just because the haze sells, will agitate their kegs or do these things to keep that haze in. And the argument's been made for the last 6 years since this style really hit the scene, that haze should be a function of your process and not some weird intended thing where you're adding, flour to your beer or something, right? I mean, that's my take, at least.
I mean, yes and no, because over time, if you give a Hefeweizen, a well-brewed, perfectly executed Hefeweizen in a can, it's going to start settling out. Gravity will win. Things that are heavy are impacted by gravity, and there's a thing called Stokes' Law, which kind of explains what's going on there. But anything that's impacted by gravity, that's not completely soluble, will over time fall towards the center of the earth, and the rate and that occurs is determined by, lots of things. Look up Stokes' Law. It's fun. Go into a wormhole of Wikipedia.
What I'm saying is this though, Malcolm, if I've had your New England IPA, it's some of the best you and Brian make some of the best New England IPA I've ever had. So kudos to you two. I've had both of yours, and you could pour me a pint and set it down, and I could come back 2 hours later, and there's no film on the bottom of the glass.
Right.
I've been to breweries where they literally pour you a pint of New England IPA.
It's settling before your eyes.
It's before you even take your first sip, and that's what I'm
settling,
talking about. That's the stuff. I don't know how they're kegging. I don't know how they get that stuff in solution out of the keg, because typically you keg a beer, that stuff's going to settle out over 2 or 3 days, and you're pulling off the top of it. So, but I don't want that, and I don't want my glass to be half full of thick sludge.
Yeah, I don't prefer that either. And I know some places do agitate the kegs, especially if you're a smaller place and you're serving, on location or whatever.
Sure.
You can store your kegs upside down, or before you hook them up, you can shake them or jostle them a little bit. But I even having worked at a larger brewery, you have to set expectations and deliver expectations. So along with that, don't be too narrowly defined in the style, because it can be on the edges.
Yeah.
It can be more bitter, less dry, more dry, creamy, whatever. Along with not being too narrowly defined, you have to set the expectation to the customer and then to deliver.
Sure.
So if the customer is expecting a hazy beer, so I'm speaking commercially, but the customer is also your friends who come over to your house to drink homebrew, or a judge if you're doing competition, or even yourself.
Sure.
If you're homebrewing, you want it to look a certain way. So how do I obtain that?
Yeah.
Well, one of the ways is letting it fully condition, and set up the opportunity for that polyphenol protein interaction to create a more stable haze.
Right.
There are additives you can use, and that's for a different show, but different tannins you can add to the process to create or help promote haze stability. But essentially, if you bring in 20 to 30% proteinaceous malt, and then you create a polyphenol-rich environment, read that as hoppy, they will collide. They will create, hopefully, a stable haze based on a proline, typically, which is amino acid, hydrogen reaction with those two materials.
Yeah.
So they will create a stable haze. Now, that should be stable for weeks, if not a month or more. But there seems to be like a fine spot where if you go too heavy, because of Stokes' law, you have a lot of that stuff. I'll use the word stuff in solution. So it gets heavier faster, and it's more impacted by gravity quicker, and it settles out more readily.
Sure.
So
sure.
There seems to be a sweet spot.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I've taken beers and looked at them under the microscopes, and the ones that have a more stable haze tend not to be very yeasty.
Interesting. And I wonder if there's not some sort of a role that yeast plays in that. So in sticking with the style descriptions, the aroma, I think if there's ever been a beer that can be called fruity in terms of the aroma, it's New England IPA. In my experience, the ones that I've had that have been made to be more piney, it's almost like those beers that West Coast IPA brewers made to be a hazy New England IPA. That pininess comes off way differently to me in New England IPA styles, and I don't find it to be particularly enjoyable. It's almost sharp, even if it's not bitter, if that makes sense.
On the bad ones, I think it leans more towards that green pine than the danky resinous pine. I don't know if that resonates with you or not.
I think so.
That was an unintentional pun, but I love it. So, yeah, like the great New England IPAs, and I'll even tout, Fathead's Headhunter or whatever. It's a great combination of like this pineapple and almost like a Christmas tree pine. But it's not quite green. It's not the hexanol green grass, fresh,
that myrcene, that really strong, like fresh hop, right? Yeah.
Well, fresh cut lawn,
Sure.
That is usually too few hops, in my opinion, or too many hops, in my opinion, too close to giving it to the customer, or hopping very cold, which is debatable. I know there's people who are friends of ours who don't believe that. Use your own experience, but I think if you have too much hop material, too much leafy green material for too long in contact with the beer at too cool a temperature, it promotes those hexanols.
Sure.
And obviously the hopping ratio and the quality of your hops, those things impact that. And I totally agree. The New England IPAs that have like that greeny brown tinge tend to have the more hexanol green grass flavor versus the classic, Firestone Walker, Fatheads, Bell's, these great IPA brewers. They tend to have more of that Christmas tree pine resin, almost weed and dank smell.
Interesting. Yeah. It's for me, both the aroma and flavor of the NEIPAs that I've really enjoyed are like tropical fruit juice, almost pog-like, which, you think pog is like a passion fruit, orange and guava. And guava to me kind of has almost a danky weed type of flavor and smell to it as well. And so I guess it does resonate with me on that front, kind of like the fruity. I mean, you think about weed, which is terpenes, which is the same. It's a cousin of the hop plant. So you kind of
cousin.
God, dude.
Cousin's a nickname for weed too.
But I think one of the more focused on components of New England IPA, outside of the appearance, of course, is the mouthfeel. And if I'm not mistaken, Brian is one who constantly refers to it as being creamy. This fluffy, cloudy, creamy mouthfeel that you get from a well-made New England IPA.
It's funny. I like drinking New England IPA with Brian because he is a very good brewer of the style, and his major hang-up is the mouthfeel. To him, it's almost like talking to a German brewer seeking that, je ne sais quoi, that it. I don't know how you say je ne sais quoi in German, but essentially the quote it for New England IPA, at least according to Brian, and I kind of agree, is that mouthfeel. It's not being for him, I should say for him, but it's like a creaminess, a silkiness, almost like you get with a saison. So a saison is at once dry, but also kind of has that glycerin.
Yeah.
Creaminess to it. New England IPA, too often, in my opinion, is harsh and thin. Now, I've had some ones that are thinner that I like and drier. The ones that are too far bitter, too far dry, and those can obviously exacerbate each other, I don't prefer.
Yeah.
But I don't like them to be heavy and creamy either.
I agree with that, and I appreciate where Brian's coming from, and I think it's because if you're going to call this thing something other than American IPA, it's got to be based on something unique, right? And a lot of people were focusing only on the appearance and the haze, but I feel the same way that that mouthfeel is one of those defining characteristics of New England IPA. And I'm with you. There have been a lot that I've had that just tastes like a West Coast IPA that has some other stuff added to it to make it hazy, and they're not as enjoyable as other ones that are made well and have that kind of silkiness to them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're thick or like a Guinness or whatever. They still taste or have that mouthfeel of a attenuated beer. There's just something different about it. It's softer, on your palate.
Yeah. Well, it has to be easy to drink, and then when you load something up with hops, and you have this protein and some yeast, to be honest, in suspension, in order to maintain that drinkability, you have to pull other control levers.
Right.
Otherwise, it's toilsome, it's troublesome to drink. It's a workload on your palate, and I mean, Hefeweizen is creamy. But they're usually pretty well attenuated, but they're creamy.
Yeah.
And not creamy like a lactose IPA creamy, but they just have like this softness to them. And you look over and you've drank, half of a 22-ounce Hefeweizen glass,
Yeah.
So that should be the same to me. That should be the hallmark of a beer, is how easy you can drink it, with the exceptions of like big barley wines and, imperial boozy stouts and stuff like that. You want to put the brakes on people a little bit there.
Yeah.
But, if you have a New England IPA at 6 to 8%, you should be able to drink it.
Yeah, I agree. Now let's talk about typical ingredients that you would use for New England IPA. Obviously, there's, I think most recipes call for a good portion of some form of pale malt. To me, this is one of those styles that really does well when that pale malt is Maris Otter or Golden Promise, something with a little bit more oomph behind it. Though I've had really well made New England IPAs that have 60 to 70% just standard pale two row and those can come out really well. I think one of the more interesting aspects of the grist that you would use for a New England IPA is that they're known for including a fairly decent charge of flaked adjunct. Usually, at least in my experience, that's flaked oats.
When people say, how do you make a New England IPA? I usually say 70 to 80% base malt and 2-row, for commercial purposes because it's cheaper.
Right.
And you have it in the brewery and does a lot of the heavy lifting, or some portion of that 70 to 80 as a UK type malt because it tends to increase maltiness.
Right.
Right. And then the other 20 to 30%, a proteinaceous malt mix. And by that, I mean wheat and oats. So I like the all oat ones. I think they're really nice. They have that slick mouthfeel, but some people do not prefer that mouthfeel.
Yeah.
And I've made like a 20% oat beer and it come out crystal clear. So
yeah.
For what it's worth. I like to have a mix of that. We'll call it 30%. We'll assume we're doing a 7% base and a 30% adjunct. I like 20% wheat, 10% oats. That's what I like. Now, there's no right way. You can adjust that 20% of wheat to be flaked, unmalted, torrefied, whatever, and then are toasted like flakes.
Sure.
And the oats could be toasted oats, naked oats, golden naked oat, which is like the granule, the kernel.
Yeah.
Before it's been steamed and smashed. Oat flour, even. All those things. And that's what's cool about the style, and that's why I say try not to be too narrowly defined, is because that 20 to 30%, and I have seen people go as high as 40, like you said, 60% of base malt. Mm-hmm. That to me is pushing it, but whatever you do, you. The mixing of that flaked, unmalted, torrefied wheat, our oats, toasted oats, golden naked oats. That's where the brewer's art is.
Yeah,
and that's when you steer the beer. But I do think you need 20 to 30% to get a stable haze.
That's what I've been hearing as well. I remember it started off, people were trying to figure out like what the right percentage is of non-barley grains to include. And I remember people saying as low as 12%, and then it got up to as high as 30%. I think most people these days, at least the recipes that I've seen online, are between that 20 and 30% spot. And I think that's pretty interesting. Again, a defining characteristic of this style. Obviously, when it comes to hops that you would use, actually, I'm curious if you had to name, 4 or 5 of your favorite hops to use for New England IPA, what are those for you, Malcolm?
Well, my number one is Strata right now. I freaking love Strata.
Great variety.
There's a great, I have like a write-up from a provider, and it says passion fruit meets pot. I'm like, yes, please.
Yeah.
Passion fruit, grapefruit, mango, and a little bit of cousin, weed. It's super, super high on total essential oils. And what I really like is that the terpenol, or terpeneol, which is tropical fruit, it's like 3 to 10 times higher than Cascade, which is, people often use Cascade as like the standard, what you measure against.
Yeah.
So it's up to 10 times, but often 3 times higher in terpenes, and it's higher in almost everything. It's higher in alpha humulene, which is the piney.
Yeah.
It's higher in citronellol and citronellol, which is the OL is citrus and the AL is fruity, generic fruity. So it's a great hop, but it does bring you some of that dank. It brings you some of that weedy. So if you want to stay away from that, I'm a big fan of Mosaic Citra. At Fatheads, they used a lot of Mosaic Citra, so I kind of just became a fan.
Yeah.
And they use it because it's great, and they use it because they have contracts for it. But
they have to.
They're great hops.
Yeah, they are.
When you get good varieties of them.
Yeah. The best luck that I've had with hops, I agree with you. I think Strata is one of the most amazing new varieties out there right now, and you listeners would love it too. You go grab some from Yakima Valley Hops. It's amazing. I know that you're not a huge fan of Brew One. I actually really enjoy the blend of Strata and Brew One in a New England IPA. It gives kind of a pina colada flavor to me. But then obviously all of the New World hops, so like Galaxy and some of the New Zealand hops. I've never had a New England IPA with Nelson. I'm not sure how well that would play, but it seems like it'd be really interesting. But yeah, those really high terpene, high oil, fruity hops that have that kind of danky, resinous thing going on, I think work really well for this style.
You asked for 4, so I said Strata, Mosaic Citra, also El Dorado. I love El Dorado.
Oh yeah,
it's like a dank pineapple.
Exactly. Like almost overripe pineapple.
Yeah,
I love that hop as well for a lot of beers, and it works incredibly well for New England IPA. Some of the best I've had have been, heavy El Dorado. So, but fruity hops in general, you want to stick with that. I think Centennial obviously is a classic that works fairly well with this style. And I know that for bittering, as little bittering as, is associated with this style, I believe it was Ed Coffey was telling me he likes to use just a small charge of CTZ or Chinook. Now this was years ago. He may have changed his ways since then. But that's been kind of the way that I've looked at it is, maybe like 8 IBU at 60 minutes, of Chinook, just to give that kind of nice piney bitterness.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know if it's necessary, but I'm kind of a creature of habit, and I've talked about it before. Having tenure and brewing at Fatheads, whatever. There seems to be some kind of mouthfeel interaction that happens with early hopping. At least I think so. It just feels right, adding a little bit of something like Centennial or Chinook, or even Cascade early in the boil. I just like it.
So do I. Makes the wort smell better too.
Yeah, it also tempers the boil.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's for the hops. As far as the yeast goes, again, very, very unique in that it's I feel, and again, this comes from somebody who doesn't brew very much New England IPA or drink it at all, but I feel like one of the things that's sort of a quote unquote required for the style is that you use a notably English or British yeast strain. The most popular, it seems to me, is the Boddington strain, which is Imperial Yeast A38 Juice, or the London Ale 3 from Y Yeast. It's an incredible strain. I've actually used it before to make a standard British Golden Ale, and it cleared up beautifully. But there's something about that strain in particular that, with the other components of how this New England IPA is made, really does seem to lend itself to that haze stability as well.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of PFM there.
Yeah.
And it seems to work, so you do it.
Yeah.
I love London Ale 3, 1318 Y Yeast, and I've had great results with Juice, which is A38. I think they're supposed to be the same strain. I don't know that for sure.
Yeah, they are. They're both Boddingtons.
Yeah, it does seem to create this, if you want to call it biotransformation, so in the presence of these oils, the yeast takes in these compounds and begets other compounds.
Yeah.
And it tends to be, for me, peachy, like peach rings, like the gummy candies, berry, like a berry, generic berry mix, and pineapple. So that juice character that people attribute, to me, I think it's the interaction with the yeast and those hops, and certain hops, sure, with certain oils. And I don't want to speak too much about it. One, because I'm not expert at it, and two, there's other people who do it better. Go look up Stan Haramis. He wrote the hops book, and he talks a lot about biotransformation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there are other yeasts as well. I think the other real popular one is Imperial Yeast calls it Barbarian. I don't think John Kimmich refers to it as Conan, but it is said to be sourced from The Alchemist, and that's another one known for that haze. The interaction that it has with hops and all the polyphenols and proteins and whatnot. So you got Conan, you got Juice.
Thames Valley works great because it's a high glycerin.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And it's a chomper. It just goes fast.
Yeah. Well, the other one that I've heard people using, and people who like dry yeast will love this, is the SO4 Fermentis. Their Safel SO4 is apparent, especially back in the day. 5-6 years ago, I was seeing SO4 on recipes from people who would otherwise, not really prefer dry yeast, but they were saying there was something special about that strain and what it contributes to this up and coming hazy style back then. I've never tried it, but it's interesting, and I think it's cool that there's that dry option. Real quick, let's run through a traditional brewing process that you might use for New England IPA. It's, for the most part, and this is typically the case for most styles, things are going to be about the same, but there are some unique aspects, starting with water chemistry. A lot of the talk is about how, West Coast IPA is very sulfate focused. So, lots of gypsum to bring those sulfate levels up to 3 to 1. I've seen even 4 to 1 when compared to chloride. That's not so much the case for New England IPA, which seems to be more chloride focused.
Yeah. What I would say here is, once again, don't be too narrowly focused. Use the water to steer what you want. Think of the expectation that you want to set. So do you want it to be dry? Do you want it to be creamy? And then deliver that in part with your other things we talked about, the wheat and the oat component, the attenuation component, but also the water component. So you have to steer your water. I prefer the ones who I've talked with professional brewers, and when I've had their beer, when they tend to be closer to 1 to 1, I seem to prefer those beers. We're talking 1 to 1 ratio of sulfate to chloride or chloride to sulfate. And lower amounts. So not super high minerality total.
Yeah.
So we're talking 100 to 100 ppm.
Yeah.
Once you start getting up a little bit higher, like 1.5 to 1, we're talking now chloride to sulfate. So let's say 150 of chloride to 100 sulfate. I don't mind that, but when I find they get much higher than 1.5 to 1, they start tasting weird to me. They start tasting minerally.
Dude. Yes. Yeah. Amen.
And I don't think that's going to be the case if it's 50, to 25. But once you start getting up in your total mineral loading, above 75 or 100, each one, they start taking on this Alka-Seltzer-like character, and I do not prefer it.
100% agree with you. To me, I call it chalky because it makes my teeth squeak. But there's a flavor associated with it. And I've had good examples of New England IPA that still have that flavor. And the only thing that I relate it to is the water chemistry and that higher chloride to sulfate ratio. I don't know for sure. It could be some other stuff. It may be the interaction with, again, flaked adjunct or something like that. But
so I have had a few sulfate to chloride ratios on New England IPAs that have worked in which the sulfate was slightly higher than chloride. But it was done for a reason, on purpose to counteract the other things that we have done.
Yeah.
So I've had as high as 1.5 and 1.25 to 1 sulfate to chloride in New England IPAs that have worked for what it's worth.
Yeah.
I just want to mention that there's not some hard set rule.
Right. Right. That's the beauty of this style. Yeah. So, well, in terms of the mash and the boil and chilling, there's really not much different than you would do, for a standard American IPA. I do think we kind of mentioned it earlier that in terms of kettle hopping, I'm seeing a lot more people these days going really, really heavy on, tail end of the boil, usually, throwing all their hops in. I've even seen at Flame Out and letting, doing like a 20-minute hop stand or chilling that wort down and then doing your hop stand then just to keep that bitterness as restrained as possible. Other than that, I don't think there's anything, much different that you're going to do with the mash, boil, and chilling. And then fermentation to me is an interesting one because I've been reading recently that people are pushing warmer temps with these English strains to really amplify that ester profile because it complements those fruity hops so well. Is that something that you're aware of, Malcolm?
Yeah, I think people tend to be willing to go a little higher than they typically would. And there's a lot of literature out there about ester production at higher temperatures, faster rates. Because a lot of the literature will tell you that actually faster reproduction and yeast growth will consume CoA, and that is a precursor to ester fermentation, formation. So you actually might get lower esters, but it does seem within reason and give, for a given set of parameters that brewing at 60 or fermenting at 66 Fahrenheit versus 68 tends to be cleaner, with everything else being equal.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've seen people pushing it to 72 degrees Fahrenheit even.
Absolutely. And so with these English yeasts, I don't mind 68 to 70 at all. And I think it begets a nice fermentation flavor. Now, another topic, but just to mention, these Kvike strains, they do tend to like and perform well, 70 to 80. I don't like going quite that high, but if you're doing a New England IPA and you want to bring in that element, I would just tell you to try like a Voss like in that 72 to 75 range. I think it's really nice.
Yeah, we should have mentioned that Kvike. I mean, Kvike is a relatively new thing as well on the brewing scene in America, at the very least. And that type of yeast, all the different variants of it, seem to be very popular for New England IPA brewers as well. In terms of fining and filtration, this is not a style you're going to run through a filter or fine with gelatin. Though we've done an experiment fining a New England IPA with gelatin, and it didn't seem to impact the haziness. So there may be something to that. Of course, you're going to package it, carbonate it. In terms of packaging, I think the biggest thing you want to mind is the oxygen ingress and making sure that you're doing everything you can to reduce oxygen exposure as possible, because this beer is very, very sensitive to that.
Yeah, you have a lot more, use the word again, stuff, and that stuff is reactive to oxygen. So I think of all styles, New England IPA might even be more sensitive to oxygen than lager.
Oh, yeah. Oh, in my experience, it absolutely is. Yeah. Well, despite having made only a few batches of New England IPA myself, I was curious to see what folks would think of one brewed up using short and shoddy methods. Results when we return from this break. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com.
Just as the Grainfather all-in-one brewing system revolutionized all-grain brewing at home, the Grainfather conical fermenter and glycol chiller take this one step further by giving homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation, just like commercial breweries use. With a full array of features including insulated double-walled construction, an innovative dual-valve yeast dump and sampling tap, and an integrated heating element and temperature controller, the conical fermenter provides a professional quality fermenting environment for superior temperature control. With the ability to individually power and control the temperature of up to 4 Grainfather conical fermenters, each with their own fermenting schedule, the Grainfather Glycol Chiller is the perfect addition to ensure superior fermenting results. And for a limited time, you can save 10% on your order by going to Grainfather.com and entering coupon code NZB during checkout. Once again, enter coupon code NZB when you order the Grainfather conical fermenter or Glycol Chiller at Grainfather.com. Once again, that's Grainfather.com.
One of the most common complaints of haughty brewers and beer drinkers when New England IPA began to grow in popularity was that its hazy appearance was due to poor brewing practices. We now know that not to be the case at all. That's not to say that people aren't, brewing shoddy, New England IPA. But what we know is that haze is caused by a confluence of factors. Of course, I couldn't resist the urge to make one using my own short and shoddy methods. So this recipe was, I came up with it just kind of as an amalgam of like past New England IPAs I made. And then, of course, looking at the people that I trust and the recipes that they're brewing. And it was pretty simple. The recipe was, I started around 10:27 a.m. I believe it was a Monday IPA morning. I collected the full volume of filtered water, and I set my controller on my SS Brewtech 1V to heat it up. I added an unmeasured amount of calcium chloride in hopes of upping that juicy character and soft mouthfeel. Now, I only did that because of the talk about calcium chloride being, kind of a higher in this style. Usually I add just sulfate. Again, it was unmeasured, but it was an amount that I was kind of used to seeing on the scale. And then while the water was heating, I proceeded to weigh out and mill the grains. For this batch, I went with a very, very simple grain build. This is one of the ones that I've actually enjoyed, and I wanted to like this beer. So I did 79% Maris Otter and 21% flaked oats. I believe I usually would do about 25 to 30% flaked oats, but I ran out. And so I went with what I had.
This is a good example right here. So you used English Maris Otter, which is more flavorful. Right. But you used oats, which tend to not be as flavorful. So unlike with using wheat, I agree with this here. I like this technique because the English is going to bring some of that component that the oats does not have.
Yeah.
So that's a good method. Whether or not you did it on purpose, who cares?
Well, I'm just glad you validated me, Malcolm. That feels good. I did a single infusion mash at 153 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees C. Only held it there for 25 minutes before removing the grain bag, giving it a good squeeze, and then setting the controller to heat the wort up. I boiled the wort for a mere 20 minutes, adding 10 grams of Magnum at first wort hop, just to make sure it had a little bit of bitterness there. And then I used 30 grams of Mosaic at 15 minutes, 30 grams each of Amarillo, Citra, and Mosaic at 5 minutes. Amarillo is another one. We didn't mention it earlier, but I really like what it does to IPA in general in terms of the fruity character. So I felt like it would work really well in this New England IPA.
Right on. Yeah, Amarillo is polarizing for a lot of people because lately I haven't loved the character of it. It's kind of gotten diesel-y, but when you get it and it's great, it's really great.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So as soon as the boil was over, again, 20-minute boil, I chilled the wort to a few degrees above groundwater temperature, which at the time ended up being around 67 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees C. A refractometer reading showed I was at 1055 OG, which I think put me at about 58 to 60% brew house efficiency, so not too bad. That's what I've come to expect when I'm doing these abbreviated mashes. I racked the wort to a sanitized Flex Plus fermenter, and then I pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast A01 House, which is Whitbread Dry, I believe that's what that house is. So not one that you would necessarily, or that at this point is associated with New England IPA, but it was the only English strain I had on hand, and I felt like I should use that instead of an American strain, something like Flagship, which is the Chico strain.
Yeah, I haven't made a New England with that, but I've made a New England with 007 based off a recommendation from a brewer in Pittsburgh who makes really good popular versions of that style. So I can imagine a dry English working well with it.
Yeah. Well, so 007 and House, I believe, are sourced from the same spot, which is, like I said, that's the Whitbread Dry. So Whitbread Brewery. So the beer was fermented in my temperature controlled chamber at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 19 C. And that's just my standard fermentation temperature. I always keep my, my chamber set to that. I finished brewing this at 12:29 for a total brew day length of 2 hours and 2 minutes. I think I was at about 2 hours and 20 minutes after cleaning up, which was pretty awesome. I mean, one of the things I enjoy most about this is how quickly I can get a batch done. The fermenter was connected to my little CO2 capture rig, so the naturally produced gas purged the keg that the beer would eventually be racked into. This isn't very complicated, and it saves CO2. I don't have to refill my tanks as often. It also reduces the risk of cold side oxidation, which I'm a huge fan of at this point. The beer was at high Kreuzen about 31 hours later, at which point I added the quote-unquote biotransformation dry hop charge using a stainless mesh screen. That was 50 grams of Citra, 40 grams of Mosaic, and 30 grams of Amarillo. Malcolm, we didn't really spend much time talking about dry hopping techniques when it comes to New England IPA. What are the methods that you use for adding dry hops to New England IPA?
I like day 2-ish. So short and Shoddy is going to be a little bit faster, but so I prefer to dry hop when there's still activity for New England IPAs. I want some of that biotransformation, but I also don't want to go too early. I don't know why. I've done everything from at yeast pitch.
Yep.
Day 1, which is arbitrary because it depends on how fast you're fermenting, and next day, which is also arbitrary because it depends on, once again, how fast you're going and your original gravity. I like to sit there and say, especially commercially, but not as easy to do. Short and Shoddy are home, but you pick a target Plato.
Sure.
So like 8 Plato, 9 Plato to go, right? And it's going to depend on the OG and FG. I do think I've observed, and I can't say I definitely have because I haven't done a controlled experiment, but I think if you dry hop with yeast pitch, it inhibits the yeast a little bit.
Interesting. Which would make sense because of the alpha acid, right? I mean, that's one of the,
And you're just coating it and you're weighing it down. And,
Sure.
So that's anecdotal, and I'm totally willing to walk that back. That's fine. But I do like to encourage biotransformation. I'm still a believer in that at this point. So I like biotransformation. I think at 2/3 of fermentation to go is a good spot to start at.
Okay, so the whole biotransformation thing is interesting, and again, it could be its own show. I have done an experiment on the biotransformation dry hop thing. I definitely think it needs to be redone. I was talking with Scott Janish about this whole concept when that experiment came out, and the gist of what he kind of was telling me is that biotransformation is something that occurs in the presence of very specific chemicals,
Yes.
and so. It could be, again, I'm no expert on this, but it could be that the hops that I used for that experiment, which did return non-significant results, didn't have the terpenes that were required, which I believe, I think it's linalool that gets converted by a specific yeast thing, into citronellol and all of this. It could be that you have to pair certain types of hops that have certain types of chemicals with a certain type of yeast that is capable of biotransforming. And
yeah, that's the best part there. Is the certain yeasts with certain oil components with certain, and the yeast has to have the right enzymes to create that cleaving action and then biotransform it. It's a long conversation. But yes, I think it depends on the yeast and the oil amount, type, both.
Yeah.
Now, there's another thing about biotransformation, not biotransformation, but haze stability creation, and that is. Part of it seems to be aided in which you have these proteins in reaction to polyphenols. Well, you bring polyphenols into the beer by not only grain itself, the husk will have polyphenols,
right?
But all that hop material. So if you wait and dry hop very, very late when a lot of the protein has settled out of the beer because of a complete fermentation, a lot of people will attenuate and then drop the temperature. A lot of the suspended matter with it, proteins, will settle to the bottom.
Right.
So you have less interaction between the polyphenols in the hops and the protein.
Yeah.
But if everything is in this, colloidal soup, and then you add the hops, there's a better chance of that interaction, that proline hydrogen interaction, to create a haze matrix, the polyphenol protein complex.
Right, more of a permanent haze, right? Yeah.
So that's potentially one of the benefits of dry hopping early.
Yeah.
But on the commercial side, some people like to go late because they want to harvest the yeast.
Well, yeah, there's that. I mean, and it's interesting. You had mentioned earlier that about New England IPA being almost kind of this kind of offshoot of West Coast and then East Coast IPAs, and kind of just taking what others were doing and making something their own. West Coast IPA, when that was becoming the thing 10, 15 years ago, all the talk was on, adding a huge dry hop charge when there's, four SG points to go in your fermentation, so that you would use, the oxygen would scrub the yeast would scrub any oxygen that was introduced, but at the same time, who knows what else was happening. And interestingly, the dry hop charge for New England IPA got moved up to high Kreuzen, which makes sense. We've done tests on, like you mentioned, adding the dry hop charge at yeast pitch, which surprisingly can work really well, if it doesn't inhibit your yeast. But yeah, I think it's interesting, all of the options that we have for dry hopping when it comes to New England IPA. Now, why did I do 50 grams Citra, 40 grams Mosaic, 30 grams Amarillo? It's because that's all I had left of most of those hops. So I just kind of went with it. With fermentation activity all but absent after 4 days of fermentation, so 3 days after I added the dry hop charge, I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer had reached the expected FG of 1010. And then another measurement taken 2 days later showed no change. So I cold crashed to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree C. Now, in terms of that FG, I know that Milkshake IPA and New England IPA are not the same thing in my book. Milkshake IPA is known just for being sweet, very, very sweet and fruity often. But New England IPA also does tend to finish a little bit higher in terms of the FG. And this was 1010, something that I think was because of the Whitbread dry strain that I used. Where do you typically see New England IPAs falling in terms of FG?
Oh, man, all over. Yeah, about 3 Plato, 12 gravity points, typical. But that's where a lot of beers end up.
Yeah.
For lower gravity ones like your beer started at 55, which is like 13, 14 Plato. It would make sense that it would finish a little drier.
Sure.
Okay. And then with your chloride and with your oats, it may give you the perception of more body than measured. So there's actual body measured and perceivable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think 10's reasonable. Anywhere from 10 to, 18.
Sure.
Really. And there's some out there that I've had that are like 5 Plato, so 10-20.
Yeah.
And you drink it and you're like, wow, this is very drinkable. And then the brewer lays it on you that it's a 5 Plato 10-20 finishing gravity. And you're like, holy cow.
I'm telling you though, I mean, we've tested this quite a bit, the whole mash temperature thing. And when you get a beer that comes back, with a higher FG, that 10 points higher SG, than one that was mashed a little bit cooler, and people still can't distinguish those. So it is interesting. I've had some that are in the 10-18, 10-20 range as well. And they taste perfectly drinkable and dry. So I think that's really interesting. This one did finish at 10-10, nice and low, really crisp, and upped that ABV just a little bit, which is what I was looking for. After 3 days total, hold on. So then I pressure transferred the beer to the keg that was purged with CO2 produced during fermentation, and then I put it in my keezer, burst carbonated it overnight before reducing the gas to serving pressure. Now, while any IPA is known to be best consumed fresh, I figured I'd wait a while because this was a short and shoddy version, and I wanted to see just how well this beer would age or what tasters would think. So I served it to tasters a month after kegging it. I just let it sit in my keezer. Now, again, I did take measures to make sure to reduce cold side oxidation as much as possible, but I was still, again, short and shoddy. This thing's sitting around, I'm being lazy, whatever. Now it's time to collect data. The appearance, even after a month in the keg, the appearance was definitely hazy. Now, it was not murky. You could still kind of make out large objects, behind the glass. You couldn't read a newspaper through it, but it was still maintained what I would, call a permanent haze.
Yeah, it's go look at the article. It's beautiful. It looks like a wit beer.
Yeah, and it's got that kind of orange glow. It's more yellow. I think more on the yellow side than it is orange, but it has that nice glow. I was very pleased with the way it came out in terms of the way it looks. Now, to my own palate, I thought it was a pretty decent representation of the style. It had a little bit of that chalky flavor, which I'm not a huge fan of. And again, that's part of why I think that comes from higher chloride levels. But that was overshadowed by the pungency of the hops. This was a very, very hoppy beer. In fact, I would be pouring a glass of it for somebody and they could smell it from 5 or 6 feet away. I
love that. I love that when a beer is so fresh and hoppy where as you're pouring it, someone's head turns around.
Yeah. What is that? You feel like you're walking through a hop field,
Yeah.
So I did feel like the AO1 house yeast contributed to the drinkability of this New England IPA. It wasn't at all viscous as many any IPAs I've had are. So that was really nice. Again, personally for me, the bitterness was very low. The hop character was incredibly fruity. There was a touch of that diesel. It's like a spicy diesel thing that I get from Mosaic when used in the dry hop. I would say personally that I still prefer, a typical clear, fruity American West Coast IPA, but this was pretty damn tasty. Definitely something that I'd make again and have on tap, in my opinion. When you dry hop with Mosaic, you mentioned it with Amarillo, but I do tend to get almost a confusing on the palate, diesel-y, not spicy like phenol spicy, but kind of a spicy character from it.
Yeah, I think it depends on obviously the year. But the plot and the provider of the hops. It seems sometimes Mosaic can get very dank. The dank onion will often be age on vine in time of the life of the hops when it's harvested. So late harvest seems to get those oniony garlic flavors.
Yeah.
The diesel thing I'm not as well researched on, but it does seem it has to do with breeding, and that's why there was a lot of a kerfuffle about Amarillo that was so popular, and then it became more diesel. I don't have the knowledge off the top of my head to say why that diesel comes about, but it does seem to be like a stressed, overly produced reaction. Because why was Amarillo so wonderful for so long, and then when it became popular, it started getting more diesel?
Yeah, that is interesting, and kind of like a natural drift, I suppose. But so I did serve this beer to 16 tasters. Obviously, this was before the whole COVID quarantine. And this was also prior to making the change where we informed tasters of the style of beer that they're evaluating. So they had no idea, at least from us, that this was a New England IPA. So the first question they were asked was to try to identify the style based on all of the, flavor, aroma, the way it looks, all that stuff. 5 out of 16 correctly chose New England IPA. I think that's pretty good. I'd call that a win. 2 thought it might be a white IPA, which I think a lot of people don't quite understand what that is. My understanding is white IPA is basically an IPA fermented with like a wit beer strain. This didn't taste like that to me, but a couple people thought it was. And then one person each put American Pale Ale, Australian Sparkling Ale, fruit and spice beer. It was very fruity, and maybe that diesel-y thing gave something away. And then Saison, and one person put spice, herb, or vegetable beer. I don't get it, but so it goes with people trying to guess styles. That's why we took that off of the survey. In terms of the average characteristic rating, how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seemed to perceive the strongest characteristic, interestingly, as being the beer's dryness, which yielded an average rating of about 3.3 out of 5. And then hoppy came in a very close second, with malty being a distant third. It's interesting to me because dryness isn't really something I tend to associate with New England IPA. And again, I feel like my yeast choice contributed to that. But if I was rating this, that the hop character was so in your face that I would have probably put a 4.5 out of 5 on the hoppiness and maybe a 3 on the dryness. But tasters felt dryness was kind of the main thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was measurably dry, and so there you go. Usually with oats, I would tend to think you'd get more of a better mouthfeel, but it's just not always the case. It's not like you add oats, you get a slick beer. It's right. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I just think that yeast choice contributed to that impression of dryness. So when we're breaking down the three, hop, malt, and yeast characteristics, in terms of hop character, 5 out of 16 noted fruitiness as being the primary hop character. Another 5 people thought it was pine and resinous. You put those two together, and I think you've got, a decent New England IPA. 3 out of 16 endorsed melon, and then 2 people said floral, and the last person said onion garlic. I definitely got a strong fruity note with pine in the background, so that makes sense to me. I did not get any onion garlic, but to each their own. People perceive different things. In terms of malt character, 11 out of 16 endorsed cracker bread crust. 2 felt it was toasty. 2 more thought that the malt character was caramel sweet, which, to be honest with you, as impressed as I was that at 4 weeks in the keg, it didn't turn, it didn't have that oxidized caramelly thing. I sort of understand how a couple people might have perceived that. It was pretty old. And then one person identified roast. I think that was fat fingers there because this thing wasn't roasty at all. But.
Well, I've said it before, like if you do enough surveys and you have a large enough, crowd, you'll get a few things that don't make any sense. That's why when I see something that's 100% preference or 100% of this thing, I say that's almost impossible because you could serve someone a glass of water and someone might accidentally say it's malty.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an expectation of just air.
Yeah. I mean, outliers are real. I mean, that happens. Yeah. So to me, the malt character just really wasn't on display in this beer. I would have said cracker bread crust as well, but really it was the hops that really shined in this beer. So in terms of yeast character, 8 out of 16 felt it was clean, and then another 3 said esters. which is what I would have probably said, but only because I think the blend of the esters with the fruity hops really amplified that fruitiness. 2 people endorsed phenolics and 2 said wild, with one person saying sulfur. The phenolics and wild indicators I think is interesting because to me, that danky diesel-y thing that I usually get from Mosaic was definitely there. And I could see how somebody might confuse that with maybe a spicy thing or whatever. The wild thing, I mean, to me, the fermentation characteristic was largely driven by an estery, but a clean ester profile that worked well with the hops. But I guess I can understand how people might think it was a phenolic. In terms of off flavors, we got more than usual on this one, which I thought was interesting. 2 tasters actually endorsed esters as the off flavor, which is kind of interesting because I'd expect esters to be in a New England IPA. So there's that.
Yeah, depends on the ester balance. Like if I have a New England IPA and I'm getting too much green apple, and I don't mean acetaldehyde, I mean like green apple or pears in apple, I don't prefer that.
Yeah, sure. No, I wouldn't like that either.
I want it to be more tropical fruit.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I didn't get that in this one. I the only odd thing that I got was a kind of a mild melon thing, but it kind of worked in my opinion. The other off flavors people noted, and this was just one taster each, marked metallic, oxidized, and alcoholic. To me, this beer was not boozy at all. It was actually quite nice. But again, people have their subjective opinions. Overall preference ratings, 4 out of 16 people rated, and this is just how much do you like the beer. 4 out of 16. So 1/4 of the tasters rated it a 5 out of 5. So they really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this New England IPA. 6 rated it a 4 out of 5. So now you got 10 out of 16 are in the 4 to 5 out of 5 range, which is pretty cool considering how it was brewed and the fact that I never make this style of beer. 2 gave it a 3 out of 5, and then 3 people rated it a 2 out of 5. There were no ratings in the 0, 1, or 2 out of 5 range, which I think is, speaks decently at least of this beer. Now, when asked how well my short and shoddy version of a New England IPA represents the style, 4 out of 16, again, so another 25%, thought it was a spot-on example and rated it a 5 out of 5. 3 more tasters gave it a 4 out of 5, 2 endorsed a 3 out of 5, and then 3 gave it a 2 out of 5, with 1 rating it a 1 out of 5, and another 3 tasters thinking that it was not at all representative of the style, rating it a 0 out of 5.
The randomness of samples,
Yeah. And if I had to rate it, and being completely honest, I would have probably been in the 2 out of 5 range myself. It had the look. It had the fruity, hoppy character, but I feel like it was lacking in that mouthfeel, like Brian would say. And it was a good beer. I actually enjoyed drinking it quite a bit, but you could tell it was brewed by somebody who prefers West Coast IPA. That's how I would put it. And wasn't going for that really creamy, cloudy mouthfeel. And I feel like there were things that I could have done differently to improve that. At the same time, it was a decent example of the style, so it wasn't that far off the mark. It just wasn't, a Congress Street or a Julius or one of those. So
yeah, well, that's what I've found in different regions is people will put their kind of twist on the New England thing. That's why I said don't be too narrowly defined. Now, if you're going to try to sell it as a classic, and then you should deliver the classic. You should give it the mouthfeel, the low bitterness. But if you are a particular brewery and you're known for being more aggressive or assertive in this way, then it's okay to put your spin on it. Just make sure, in talking commercially, you say so. Or if you're doing a competition, you might try to say it's experimental. It's a more bitter version, of New England IPA. That's fine.
Yeah.
Who cares? And for homebrew, if it's just for you and your friends, grip it and rip it.
Yeah. I'm with you on that, man. Well, so again, overall, I thought it was a decent example of the style. I was pleased with the outcome of this one. I don't think that there were any necessarily negatives that came from the process that I used. I tend to think that any faults in this beer in terms of its, how it holds up to the perfect New England IPA were probably recipe related and not so much process related. Again, that's just me. If I were to do anything different, I would probably toss in a little bit more non-barley malt, up it to 30%. And I would probably, like you mentioned earlier, blend in some maybe malted wheat or torrefied wheat with those flaked oats, because I do think that might amplify that mouthfeel a little bit more. But all in all, I was pretty pleased with it. We did get quite a few comments on this article, and so we're going to go through those real quick now. Jordan H. says, what is your usual hit to efficiency when you do the shortened mash? I'd love to try it, but I'm not sure what the likely hit to efficiency would be and how much to increase my fermentables to hit my target OG. This will be different for everybody depending on their equipment setup and what they've honed as being their brew house efficiency. Malcolm, I don't know if you've done abbreviated mashes, but for me, typically, if I'm doing a 60-minute mash rest, I'm in that 70 to 73% brew house efficiency range. When I do a 20-minute mash rest, it can drop me down to about 56 to 58. If I bump that up to 30 minutes, which has been my kind of go-to short and shoddy mash rest length these days, it gets me into that 60 to 64% range, and I'm perfectly happy with that. And that, again, that's full volume, brew in a bag. So I'm not doing a batch sparge or a fly sparge, which will typically increase your efficiency a little bit. Malcolm, any comments on that one from you?
Nope, I'm right there, 65%. If I do like an abbreviated mash, like 30 minutes or so, I'll do like a one stir about halfway through.
Yep.
And then maybe a stir before I sparge or louder, I should say. So that's what I get, about 60, 65. If I do a more rigorous mash and recirc, I'm in the 75 range, almost 80,
Yeah, that's where I'm at as well.
I no longer care about that unless I'm trying to do a specific type of beer for, and technique. If I'm trying to nail it and maybe like a lager, I expect to be in the high 70s, you know, but I think this type of beer, the New England IPA, is ideal for the short and shoddy method.
Yeah,
and
I think so too.
Not for the negative reasons that people might think. It's because of the things that you're trying to get out of a longer brew cycle is designed to beget certain things, and we don't care about them as much here.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just to respond to the increase in fermentables, the difference between, let's just take 65% and 75% brew house efficiency might be 2 pounds of pale malt. It's not much to get you back up to
$3.
Yeah. Well, and if you buy in bulk, it's maybe $1, Yeah. So, and that's why I think people who chase efficiency, I feel like it's just fruitless. It's not really worth it. But hey, if that's your gig, go for it. That's what homebrewing's all about. So, next comment comes from our friend Vinny, who is a great guy. He's a proud masshole, he says. Thank you for at least acknowledging it's a New England IPA and not this BS Northeast IPA that New Yorkers are trying to foist upon us. They hate us because they ain't us. Yankees suck.
I love this guy.
I love Vinny. Yeah, he's great.
Obviously, being a masshole myself, you have to know that that's just the way it is up there,
That's what I hear.
But and this guy would buy you a beer after making fun of your Yankees hat.
That's right. There you go. He's a great guy.
Yeah. So cool. New England IPA for life.
Yeah, it seems like what it stuck with. So we're New England IPA now. So next comment comes from Jack Offeiler. He says, when you say a heap of calcium chloride, roughly how much do you mean? I don't really know. I would say based on my water profile, which I thankfully have very, very soft water, I'd add, 10 to 15 grams is what was in my palm. Typically, I'm going a little bit lower than that and balancing it out with sulfate. That wasn't the case because this was short and shoddy. So it's going to be different, though, based on your starting water profile. And if you're with RO, you're going to be adding more minerals to ramp up your mineral profile. So final comment comes from Reddit user AP Complete. Who says, for anyone who actually wants to brew a short version of any IPA, just remove all boil hops, bring it to a boil, then cut the heat and ferment with Kveik at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 32 C. You can dry hop on day one and go grain to glass in less than 7 days. If you want bitterness, just start your whirlpool a little higher than the typical 170F or 77 C, and then you can cut the mash down as you see fit.
I don't disagree. I'm a little more restrained with Kveik temperatures. I know people have good results with them. I want to explore that more, but for me, when I get too high on the Kveiks, I get that rancid, rotten pineapple, tired fruit, the brown fruit in the bottom of the fruit bin flavor. That's for me. I'm sure it can be done well. Maybe it's something I'm not doing right. But when I am in the more restrained upper 70s, low 80s for Kvike, I prefer that.
Yeah.
Try both. Tell me I'm full of BS. Get in line.
You get that enough from us, Malcolm.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's an interesting idea. Kvike is one of those things that I've not glommed onto. I haven't been a huge fan of the many of the non-New England IPA beers that I've had fermented with Kvike. I don't know if that's because of the Kvike or not, but I will say that some of the best New England IPAs that I've had that have been made locally have been by a buddy who loves Kvike and uses various versions of Kvike to make New England IPA and even milkshake IPAs that even I enjoy. I mean, they're good. And so he's doing something well there. And so I appreciate the idea. The nice thing about New England IPA is that it's not defined by the yeast. So if you can get away with making one with a lager yeast, then go for it. Maybe that'll work. But again, turn a beer around in 7 days. Boy, that's blasphemy.
That's
right?
awesome. That's awesome. If the beer is good.
Yeah, that's all that matters. And if the beer is good and you like it and your friends enjoy it, then bonus. That's cool. So, well, Malcolm, that is all the time. We've actually gone over our time talking about New England IPA in this episode. Do you have anything else before we wrap things up?
Yeah, how could a beer that's been around for such a short time take so long to talk about?
Good point. I actually think it's because of the novelty of this style that makes it so easy to kind of dig into these different aspects of it. And I thought this was a good conversation about a style that is not going to be going away anytime soon. Well, all right, don't forget that you can click in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy New England IPA. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through